Before sunrise on the 1st of July 1916, thousands of British soldiers waited in trenches along the Somme, just before an attack. Many were volunteers. For some, these would be the final minutes of their lives. 0 hour was fixed for 7:30 in the morning. After a week of bombardment, commanders expected German trenches, artillery positions, and barbed wire to have been devastated. Mines exploded beneath sections of the German line. Artillery thundered across the countryside. Then the guns began to fall silent, and British infantry prepared to climb into the open. Before the day was over, Britain would record 57,470 casualties. 19,240 men were dead. No single day in British military history has produced a greater toll.
By 1916, the Western Front had become a vast, fortified barrier stretching across Europe. Trenches, machine guns, artillery, and barbed wire had transformed attempts at breakthrough into battles of attrition.
The Somme had been planned as a joint Anglo-French offensive, but Germany's massive attack at Verdun placed enormous pressure on France, forcing Britain to assume a greater role in the coming battle. The army Britain sent to the Somme was unlike the small professional force that entered the war in 1914. Its ranks now contained huge numbers of wartime volunteers. Many had enlisted alongside friends, colleagues, and neighbors. The so-called PALS battalions created extraordinary comradeship, but they also meant that a disaster at the front could devastate an entire community at home. Across no man's land stood an enemy that had spent months strengthening its position. German trenches included deep dugouts, reinforced shelters, machine gun positions, and dense belts of barbed wire. To cross this ground, infantry first had to survive enemy artillery and machine guns, then negotiate shell holes and earthworks partially hidden by smoke, shell holes and wire, before reaching a trench whose defenders might still be alive. On 24th of June, British artillery opened what was intended to be a crushing bombardment. For days, enormous quantities of shells were fired against German positions. But many German shelters were deep enough to protect their occupants. Above them, the battlefield was being transformed. Underground, men waited for the bombardment to stop. The bombardment did severe damage, but it did not accomplish everything expected of it. In places, the wire remained intact, and defensive positions survived. Then, on the morning of July 1st, the barrage approached its final moments. What happened next would depend on whether the German army had actually been destroyed. At 7:30, whistles sounded. Along miles of front, British infantry began climbing their ladders. For years afterward, this moment would become an enduring image of the First World War. Men leaving the relative protection of the trench and entering exposed no man's land. 14 British divisions attacked that morning. Across much of the front, soldiers moved into a landscape where German resistance had not been eliminated. As the bombardment moved away, surviving German soldiers emerged from underground shelters. They returned to firing positions and prepared machine guns. The machine gun gave a small defensive team devastating power over open ground. Where British artillery had failed to suppress these positions, attacking infantry faced catastrophic fire. Men crossed ground already shattered by artillery. Shell holes slowed formations. Surviving wire redirected them. Enemy fire forced survivors toward whatever cover they could find. For some units, the wire became a deadly bottleneck. Where gaps had not been created, men were exposed for precious seconds while searching for a way through. In several sectors, formations that had entered the attack minutes earlier were shattered before reaching the German front line. Behind the attack, stretcher bearers and medical teams confronted a flow of casualties that continued to grow throughout the morning. The word casualty did not mean only the dead. It included men killed, wounded, and missing. But by nightfall, almost 20,000 British soldiers had been killed. The disaster was not uniform. In parts of the southern battlefield, British formations captured objectives, while French forces south of the Somme also made significant progress. Near Montauban, British troops achieved important local success. Mametz was also taken. These gains proved that the offensive was not identical along every section of the front. At the Schwaben redoubt, men of the 36th Ulster Division broke deeply into German positions. But without sufficient progress on their flanks, the gains could not be securely held. The first day, therefore, contained both local success and enormous failure. But across much of the British sector, the decisive breakthrough commanders hoped for never came. One reason lay beneath the battlefield itself. German defensive works included shelters capable of protecting soldiers from much of the bombardment. British firepower was enormous, but quantity did not guarantee effectiveness. Shell quality, surviving wire, and resilient defensive positions all reduced what the bombardment actually achieved. Once the battle began, command and communication became extraordinarily difficult. Telephone lines could be cut by shell fire, while runners carrying messages faced the same battlefield as everyone else. Coordinating artillery and infantry was one of industrial warfare's hardest problems. Too close a barrage could kill friendly troops. Too far ahead, and defenders had time to recover. Plans drawn on maps were ultimately carried out by individual men, many experiencing battle on this scale for the first time. As reports arrived at headquarters, the scale of the losses became clearer. Yet the offensive could not simply be abandoned, while France remained under enormous pressure at Verdun. By evening, there had been no decisive breakthrough. Instead, the British Army had suffered losses on a scale unprecedented in its history. The official total eventually stood at 57,470 British casualties on the first day. Of these, 19,240 had been killed. Behind every number was a person. And behind many of those men was a family, a workplace, a street or a village waiting for news. July 1st was only the beginning. Fighting continued through summer and autumn. The Somme became a prolonged battle of attrition rather than the rapid breakthrough planners had envisioned. The campaign also became a testing ground for new tactics and weapons. Tanks appeared in battle for the first time in September, but they could not transform the Somme into the decisive victory once imagined. More than a century later, the Somme remains a symbol of courage, loss, and the terrible human cost of industrial war.